Qi is one of the most commonly referenced concepts in Chinese medicine. At the same time, it is one of the most misunderstood. In popular explanations, Qi is often described as a kind of invisible energy, something that flows through the body, something that can be increased, depleted, or blocked. While this description may sound intuitive, it creates more confusion than clarity. The idea of qi as a substance or force is not how the concept originally functioned. Treating it this way makes Chinese medicine appear vague or mystical, when it was never intended to be either. Much of this misunderstanding comes from translation. When early Western interpreters encountered the term qi, they attempted to map it onto familiar scientific or spiritual ideas. Words like energy, force, or vital essence were used as approximations, not because they were accurate, but because there was no direct equivalent in modern language. Over time, these approximations hardened into definitions. Qi began to be treated as if it were a thing that existed on its own. This shift subtly changed how the entire system was interpreted. Instead of being understood as a way of describing function and activity, qi became something imagined as moving through channels, accumulating in locations, or behaving like a measurable substance. When viewed this way, Chinese medicine can seem incompatible with physiology or anatomy. It can appear incompatible with rational inquiry. But this incompatibility is not inherent to the system itself. It arises from applying the wrong conceptual frame. Classical Chinese medicine did not begin by asking what the body is made of. It began by asking how processes function, how movement is generated, how transformation occurs, and how coordination is maintained over time. Within that context, qi was never a mysterious energy. It was a practical term used to describe activity, capacity, and function. As these could be observed in living systems, before qi can be understood correctly, it has to be released from later assumptions. This chapter is not about redefining qi. It is about clearing away the interpretations that prevent it from being understood at all. Once those assumptions are set aside, qi begins to function not as a belief, but as a descriptive tool. From there, the rest of the system begins to make sense. Qi does not refer to a substance that exists independently within the body. It does not name a material thing that can be isolated, stored, or extracted. Instead, qi refers to function. It describes what something is doing rather than what something is. When classical Chinese medicine speaks about qi, it is describing activity, movement, capacity, and the ability of a process to perform its role. This is why qi is always contextual. There is no such thing as qi in general. Qi is always the qi of something. It refers to how a process operates within a specific situation. When digestion occurs, qi describes the functional activity that allows transformation to take place. When circulation occurs, qi describes the movement that allows distribution to happen. When warmth is maintained, qi describes the activity that sustains temperature and responsiveness. In each case, qi is not an added ingredient. It is the name given to the functioning itself. This is why translating qi as energy is misleading. Energy implies a thing that can be measured, transferred, or quantified. Qi does not behave that way. It cannot be separated from the process it describes. If the process stops, the qi is no longer present, because qi was never a substance to begin with. Qi is not treated as a cause that produces effects. It is treated as the name given to activity when activity is observed in context. This distinction matters because it changes how explanation works. Instead of asking what caused something to happen, Chinese medicine asks how a process is functioning, and whether that function is appropriate to the situation. When qi is described as strong or weak, this does not mean there is more or less of a substance present. It means that a process is performing its role effectively, or that it is failing to do so. For example, when movement is described as insufficient, qi is said to be constrained or weak. When movement is excessive or unregulated, qi is said to be agitated or reckless. These descriptions do not refer to different things. They refer to different functional states of the same process. This is why qi cannot be understood without reference to context. A function that is appropriate in one situation may be inappropriate in another, and the same activity may be described differently depending on timing, demand, and environment. Qi is therefore inseparable from conditions. It is always evaluated relative to what the system is being asked to do. This is one reason Chinese medical theory avoids fixed normal values. Function is assessed dynamically rather than against static benchmarks. Another important implication follows from this understanding. If qi describes function, then dysfunction does not require the presence of a foreign object or defect. It can arise simply from miscoordination, from mistiming, or from the inappropriate persistence of a once useful activity. This is why imbalance is often described directionally rather than as the presence or absence of a thing. Qi may be described as rising when it should descend, as dispersing when it should consolidate, or as stagnating when it should move freely. In each case, the language points toward how function is unfolding, not toward an entity that must be removed or added. Understanding qi this way also explains why treatment focuses on regulation rather than replacement. Interventions aim to guide function back toward appropriateness, not to supply a missing substance, and not to eliminate an offending force. This functional orientation keeps the system internally consistent. It allows complex physiological behavior to be described without reducing it to mechanical parts. And it preserves sensitivity to timing, proportion, and relationship. When qi is approached as function rather than substance, the entire theoretical framework remains coherent, and the models that follow become interpretable without contradiction. Qi is never discussed in isolation from function. It is always described in terms of what it allows the body to do. For this reason, classical Chinese medicine focuses less on where qi is located, and more on how qi operates across the system as a whole. When qi is functioning appropriately, movement is smooth, transformation occurs without friction, and coordination between processes is maintained. Rather than assigning qi to a single structure, the model describes recurring modes of activity. These modes reflect how function expresses itself in living systems. One of the most fundamental ways qi operates is through movement. Movement does not only refer to physical motion, it includes the circulation of substances, the progression of processes, and the ability of one phase of activity to transition into the next. When qi moves appropriately, processes do not become stuck. Inputs are received, transformed, and carried forward without obstruction. When this movement is impaired, qi is described as constrained or stagnant, not because something physical is blocking a pathway, but because function is failing to progress as it should. Another core operation of qi is warming. Warming does not imply heat as a measurable temperature alone. It refers to the activity that sustains responsiveness and metabolic readiness. Without adequate warming activity, processes slow, reaction time diminishes, and coordination becomes delayed. In this sense, warmth reflects functional vitality rather than thermal output. Qi is also responsible for transformation. Transformation refers to the capacity of the system to change inputs into usable outputs, food into nourishment, air into usable capacity, stimulus into response. Transformation is not a single event. It is an ongoing process that depends on timing, sequence, and proportion. When transformation is effective, resources are generated without accumulation. When it is impaired, substances may linger without being fully integrated. This is described not as material excess alone, but as a failure of functional conversion. Another essential operation of qi is containment. Containment refers to the ability of the system to hold things in their appropriate place and to maintain boundaries between processes. This includes the ability to retain fluids, to maintain structural integrity, and to prevent excessive leakage or dispersion of function. When containment is adequate, processes remain regulated. When it fails, qi is described as sinking or collapsing, not because qi is physically falling, but because function is no longer being maintained within appropriate limits. These modes of operation are not separate types of qi. They are different ways of describing how function expresses itself, depending on context, demand, and system-wide coordination. Importantly, these operations do not occur independently. Movement supports transformation. Warming supports movement. Containment regulates both. Qi is therefore understood as integrated activity, rather than as a collection of discrete functions. This integration explains why disturbance in one area often affects others. Because qi is not localized, its operations ripple across the system. When these operations are balanced, the body adapts smoothly to change. When they fall out of proportion, strain develops gradually, often before discrete symptoms appear. By observing how qi operates rather than where it is stored, classical Chinese medicine remains focused on function over form and on regulation over intervention. This operational view of qi sets the stage for understanding how organ systems coordinate activity and why later models focus on relationship rather than isolated mechanisms. Qi never exists independently of what it describes. It does not float freely within the body, and it does not operate as a detached force. Qi is always the qi of a process, of a function, or of a system responding to specific conditions. This is why qi can never be understood in isolation. To speak about qi without context is to remove the very thing that gives it meaning. In classical Chinese medicine, qi is always evaluated relative to circumstance, relative to timing, demand, environment, and the overall state of coordination within the system. A function that is appropriate in one situation may become problematic in another, not because the function itself has changed, but because the context has shifted. This contextual nature explains why the same activity can be described differently at different times. Qi may be described as excessive in one setting and insufficient in another, even when the observable activity appears similar. What changes is not the activity alone, but how well that activity fits the situation. This approach prevents fixed judgments. It avoids labeling a function as inherently good or bad. Instead, it asks whether the function is appropriate to current conditions. Because qi is contextual, Chinese medicine does not rely on universal standards. There are no absolute values that define normal or abnormal qi. Assessment is always comparative, relative to the individual, relative to their environment, and relative to the phase of change they are undergoing. This is why evaluation emphasizes pattern rather than measurement. Patterns reveal how functions interact over time. Measurements capture isolated moments. Qi belongs to the former, not the latter. Another implication of qi's contextual nature is that it cannot be separated from yin and yang. Qi always expresses itself through relational polarity, activity and rest, expansion and contraction, warming and cooling. Qi is the functional expression of these relationships, not something layered on top of them. Because of this, qi cannot be increased or decreased in the abstract. It can only be regulated in relation to opposing tendencies. Strengthening qi without regard to balance leads to strain. Reducing qi without regard to demand leads to collapse. Context determines direction, and direction determines interpretation. Qi is also inseparable from time. Function unfolds across duration, not in static snapshots. A process that is adaptive in the short term may become disruptive if prolonged. Likewise, a function that appears insufficient at one moment may be appropriate as part of recovery or consolidation. This temporal sensitivity allows subtle shifts to be recognized early, before breakdown becomes fixed. It also prevents overcorrection by recognizing when change is already underway, rather than forcing adjustment prematurely. Because qi is contextual, it is never treated as a target in itself. Treatment does not aim to add qi or remove qi as if it were a substance. It aims to restore appropriate function within the conditions that exist. This may involve guiding movement, supporting transformation, stabilizing containment, or reducing unnecessary strain. Each intervention responds to the situation, not to an abstract diagnosis. This responsiveness is what allows Chinese medicine to remain flexible, and why it adapts to variation rather than enforcing uniformity. Qi's contextual nature also explains why explanations in Chinese medicine often sound indirect. They describe tendencies rather than causes, directions rather than quantities, and relationships rather than objects. This is not a limitation of the model, it is a deliberate choice, one that preserves sensitivity to living systems by refusing to freeze function into fixed categories. When qi is understood contextually, the system avoids reification. It does not turn descriptions into entities or metaphors into mechanisms. Qi remains what it was always intended to be, a way of speaking about function as it unfolds within specific conditions. Over time, understanding this prevents qi from becoming mystical and prevents interpretation from drifting into abstraction. It keeps attention grounded in observation and in the lived reality of functional change. With this contextual understanding in place, qi can now be related clearly to other models, without contradiction, and without requiring belief. This sets the stage for understanding how qi integrates with yin and yang, with the 5 phases, and with the organization of the organ systems, which brings the theoretical framework together as a coherent whole. Qi does not function as a separate model within Chinese medical theory. It serves as a connective principle that links earlier frameworks together. Once qi is understood as function, its relationship to yin and yang becomes clear. Yin and yang describe relational polarity dash 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 dash. Qi describes the activity that moves within that polarity. Yin and yang define direction. Qi describes execution. When activity increases, qi expresses yang tendencies. When activity consolidates, qi expresses yin tendencies. Qi does not replace yin and yang. It gives those relationships functional expression. This is why qi is never discussed independently of balance, because its behavior always reflects relational conditions. Qi also integrates naturally with the 5 phases. The 5 phases describe recurring patterns of transformation. Qi describes how those transformations actually occur. Wood describes emergence and expansion. Qi describes the functional movement that allows expansion to happen. Fire describes activity and expression. Qi describes the intensity and responsiveness of that activity. Earth describes integration and stabilization. Qi describes the capacity to transform and distribute resources. Metal describes contraction and regulation. Qi describes the activity that refines and contains. Water describes storage and potential. Qi describes the maintenance of capacity over time. In this way, the 5 phases provide pattern, and Qi provides function. They are not separate explanations. They are different resolutions of the same system. Qi also serves as the bridge between abstract theory and organ function. Organ systems are not defined by anatomy alone. They are defined by coordinated activity. Qi describes how that activity is carried out. When an organ system is said to function well, this means its qi is operating appropriately within its role. When dysfunction appears, it reflects disordered activity, not a broken structure. This is why diagnosis in Chinese medicine focuses on patterns of function, rather than isolated lesions or defects. Qi allows these patterns to be described without reducing complexity. It connects movement, transformation, containment, and regulation into a coherent whole. Because Qi is functional, it also explains why treatment emphasizes guidance rather than correction. Interventions aim to support appropriate activity, to reduce strain, and to restore coordination between systems, rather than to fix a single component. Qi's integrative role also explains why Chinese medicine resists linear causality. Changes are rarely traced back to one source. They emerge from interaction, accumulation, and imbalance over time. Qi provides the language for describing these interactions, without collapsing them into a single mechanism. With Qi in place, the earlier models no longer function as abstractions. They become operational. They describe how living systems adapt, respond, and reorganize under changing conditions. This integration is what allows Chinese medical theory to remain flexible, and why it can be applied across different bodies, different environments, and different stages of life. Qi is therefore not an additional layer added onto the system. It is the thread that ties the system together, linking relationship, pattern, and function into a single explanatory framework. With this understanding, Qi no longer appears abstract or mystical. It becomes precise, operational, and grounded in observation. This completes the foundational role of Qi within Chinese medical area and prepares the ground for exploring how these principles organize specific organ systems, which is where the series will move next.